half of Australian households now are renting. So that's half of Australian households who are retiring with an absolute dependence on income to keep a roof over their heads. It's pretty scary to me. So the fourth myth that we've busted is that pension and healthcare costs will blow the budget. What about the cost of growth rate? And I realise I'm probably going a bit over time, so we'll run through this pretty quickly because most of you probably heard bits of it before. A higher population growth means that a greater proportion of the total economic activity that we're doing is dedicated to expanding the infrastructure, equipment and skills that we need to support our population. So for each 1% of population growth, around 7 to 10% of GDP is needed to expand things. In the meantime, we're getting 1% more revenue. That's supposing the added people are gaining employment just as easily as if we weren't having that population growth. Government infrastructure spending has been around 1.85% of GDP per 1% population growth. Nearly twice as much cost to government directly as they might expect back in revenue, just from having to create infrastructure, not from dealing with all the other issues around population growth. This increased burden is proportional to the lifespan of the assets. So if, for instance, power stations are going to live for 50 years, then we would need to replace 2% of them per annum to keep a constant stock of them. If our population is growing at 2% per annum, we need to add 2% more power stations each year. This year, or we end up with less capacity to produce power per person. So that's a 100% increase in the amount of money we have to spend on building power stations. And it's the same sum across everything. It's a very disproportionate increase in burden because of the longevity of these things. Things that last long, we actually have to spend relatively little per year to maintain, but we have to spend a whole lot in a year to create the extra unit that we need for population growth. This is an opportunity cost. You know, people say, oh well, you know, building all that stuff is going to create employment. But well, if we didn't build it, we'd still spend the money. We can just spend it on something else. We might spend it on better healthcare. We might spend it on
free universities,
renewable energy infrastructure. Yeah, free universities. We have the money to spend. So compared with the cost of ageing, the cost of growth is much bigger. In the first intergenerational report, comparing the costs that they costed out there as a proportion of GDP for a stabilising Australian population that's going to stabilise around 25 million, compared with the projection in the so-called Big Australia in the previous intergenerational report of 2010, the difference is 1% of GDP. That's with the really negative data picking type of analysis that we've already debunked in the intergenerational report. So we probably wouldn't even have that much increase in costs because the healthcare costs aren't going to increase in proportion to the aged population. Public infrastructure cost of growth has historically been around 2.6% of GDP, but it's currently nearly half as high again because of the diseconomies of density, because we're having to build tunnels and desalination plants and all of those things that we have to do in order to cram extra infrastructure into an already built up environment. In the future, we could expect the energy and materials needed to build that infrastructure to outpace inflation. Energy is going to get more expensive in the future. So it'd be better if our costs were based on labour-intensive things that aren't going to get more expensive in the future than to resource-intensive things that are likely to get more costly. So why not have a burden of health rather than a burden of construction? That growth more than doubles, the growth rate, more than doubles the cost of decarbonising our economy. So instead of having to just incrementally transfer our current power generation capacity to renewables, in the same time we have to double the amount of power we need to generate. So that's twice as much renewable energy capacity as if we were just replacing what's already here. And of course there are many non-monetary costs in terms of loss of biodiversity and public amenities. So the fifth myth that we're busting is that high population growth will ease fiscal pressures. It certainly has very much exacerbated fiscal pressures. It's probably the biggest reason that government deficits have blown out in the last decade. I just want to spend a couple more minutes talking about this misconception of investment, because the reason the government isn't worried about the cost of all this infrastructure is that it thinks it doesn't have to pay for it, because it's going to pay for itself. Because when we build it, it's going to increase productivity and people are going to use it and get a benefit from it, so we can charge them a fee for it and we can get private industry to pay for it, or we can borrow money against it because it's an investment. So just to try and explain what's an investment and what's a recurrent cost. People think that if you have to pay a whole lot now and build something and it's there for a very long time, we use it, therefore it's an investment. But an investment is something that we sacrifice current consumption in order to get a benefit in the future. A recurrent cost is something we have to do in order not to go backwards. So I've got to go and buy my groceries every week, otherwise the pantry will become empty and then I'll go hungry. You know, in order to keep the status quo, I've got to spend that money every week, and that's a recurrent cost. So the question is, if we didn't do it, would we be no worse off? If we didn't build any more infrastructure to accommodate more people, would we be no worse off, given that we've got population growth? Clearly, we would be progressively worse off. You know, clearly we're already worse off because of lengthening waiting lists in hospitals and things. Obviously, it's a recurrent cost, and this is just illustrating it graphically. If in year one we have a certain inventory of any particular class of durable assets, the next year a certain proportion of them are retired, and in the meantime the population's grown, so we have a greater demand for the services of that class of assets. So we can add to that inventory. We have to add a certain amount to replace those that are retired, but we have to add more to expand to accommodate the extra population. If beyond that we have the capacity, we could improve the per capita services level by adding more. So both the maintenance and the expansion are recurrent cost, the cost of standing still. Only if we have the capacity to do more than that can we say that it's an investment. Now, if, because the population growth has just doubled over the last decade and our state and local government budgets haven't done that, we don't actually have the money to expand infrastructure at the pace of population growth, then either we borrow the money to do that and we end up with a fiscal deficit, or we don't build it and we end up with an infrastructure deficit. One way or other, we've got a deficit. Is that going to pay itself back? Does that make it easier in the future to pay back? Well, the next year we've got the same problem and the deficit gets bigger. So that goes on into the future. There's no future time in which we're in a better position to pay that back. So if you're talking about a recurrent cost, there's no time that's easier to pay for it than now. If we can't pay for it now, we're in a really serious situation in terms of fiscal sustainability. So myth 6 is that expanding infrastructure is an investment that will pay for itself in the future. If that infrastructure is to accommodate population growth, this is not true. Just to visualise this burden of paying for things that added people need, if we think that, you know, if we're going to have an extra 10 million people in the next 20 years or 30 years, it's the current people who have to find the money to do that through our taxes. So we're already familiar with the idea that the working age people have to generate enough wealth to cover the needs of the young and the old, and that's what the dependency concept is about. And these pie charts can compare different countries with different age structures so that you can see that Australia's got the largest working age proportion of the pie, and it shrinks just a little bit when you get an older population like Japan. But if you add in what's needed to pay for adding people, for the infrastructure, equipment and training that we need to spend on expanding our population, then the burden carried by the working age people is much less in Japan than it is in Australia, because they don't have to do that stuff. So how would you rather spend $30 billion per year? This is the opportunity cost. Should we be restoring welfare and community services? Should we be restoring university funding, environmental rehabilitation, renewable energy, universal dental health care, whatever you like to spend it on? We would have that bucket of money if we weren't spending it on population growth. So we started off with this idea that we have to, you know, we all know we don't like congestion and biodiversity loss, but we have to put up with it because we need population growth for prosperity. And when we've looked at it, in fact, there's no substance to that prosperity argument. It's evaporated. But when we look at it further, in fact, that population growth is a massive economic burden that really adds to all the other negatives of population growth, and there's really nothing left in the benefit side of the picture. Catherine already talked about the positives of a declining or of an ageing population, but if we look at that in terms of that's what we'd have to look forward to in an older and even shrinking population. There are many positives. Smarter, a greater proportion of people with higher education. Cleaner, fewer greenhouse gases. Richer because of the concentration of inheritance rather than the dilution of inheritance. Healthier, the longer we live a healthy life, the higher proportion of our life is spent in good health. And the more leisure we have is part of the life cycle. This was from an analysis from a German group that published it quite recently. So that's the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean. That's fantastic. Well, we won't have any questions right now. I think we'll go straight into the coffee break. Obviously, there's a lot of information in that talk, and I think we'll have to make sure that we get the speakers' presentations and we make them available as PDF files. Especially too, because this filming with the camera isn't showing the actual slides, so people who are listening